someone had bought 3 or 8 of their token for 53 Tau. I think they were people who didn't understand the dynamics of early aping, because of course those that were doing this properly were running scripts that were buying just a carefully calculated amount, block after block after block after block. So of course buying a large amount early on was not sensible, but people have bought pizza for 1,000 Bitcoin, so there's always going to be points in history where we can look at a coin that's been wasted for the greater good. I can't give away all of our roadmap in a slightly competitive industry, but it is to secure that position as the most feature-rich one-stop shop for all things Bittensor, and really satisfying all of what we call the personas: validators, miners, subnet owners, retail investors, researchers, to make sure that we have the tools in place for all of those personas to interact with the network and get back all of the information they require. And as a result, from indexing and amassing this trove of data and then making it available from our API, being the one-stop shop for those wishing to build either something better, something alternative, supporting data infrastructure for subnets, or anything that anyone wants to build on the network, where they realize the task ahead when indexing this chain is not quite as easy as you might think. And so just tapping into our API, where we have indexed and continue to index masses of data points. I would very much like people to be concentrating on the longer term of what they can build and what they can achieve, rather than short-term incentive extraction. And that's not to say, that is often people's initial draw into this network, be it as a miner, be it as now a trader, or someone building bots and algorithms and ARBs within dTAO. But none of that works if we don't have the people with greater vision understanding how they can use incentive mechanisms and distributed compute to solve problems and build for the future. So it's those people that I really want to speak to and encourage to get into the network. And whilst it may seem that there's always someone around you who's extracting more liquidity through mining, through this, through that, without those people, the network doesn't exist. And over the long term, those are the people that take the most value from the network.
Welcome to the Ventura Labs podcast. Today, we're joined by Marcus, commonly known as Mog, who shares his insights on Bittensor's ecosystem and the effects of dTAO being live. We discuss the rise of Taostats, the evolving role of validators, and the state of subnets. We also touch on market dynamics and the importance of sustainable business models in driving the ecosystem's success. Now, back to Marcus with the 29th Ventura Labs podcast. Mog, how are you doing? Round 2. You're the first round 2 on the podcast. How are you doing today? It's good to have you back.
Very good indeed. Sun shining. Very happy. It's a lovely day.
Great to be here. And we last talked in August. There was about 45 subnets because of the subnet limit at the time. Now we are post-dTAO. 70 or 69 subnets, 70 if you include root, and there is now no subnet limit. So how has dTAO changed your life as Taostats and your validator?
Well, I would like to say, and in the long term, and especially from today, it has freed me. But I don't think it's been that feeling for the last week. Obviously, for the last week, it has been pedal to the metal, making sure that we've got as many data points and things that people need in order to interact with dTAO, showing within Taostats. But the fact that my entire week's focus has been on Taostats, and no subnet has come to me to ask me to review their code base or talk to them about potentially, well, other than the ones I was already talking to, it's been wonderful because I've been focusing firmly on Taostats. End of that last week, we finished fixing pretty much every bug and everything with what we had shipped. And now this week, it's Monday morning, or it was Monday morning, and we are now going head full strong into the week, building new features, new things, adding what we want, what our users are requesting, and just really building out Taostats. And that's a huge pleasure for me to be concentrating on what is my favorite part of Bittensor. I'm slightly biased, but it is.
And Taostats, I believe, is the official block explorer for Bittensor, correct?
Nothing's official in Bittensor, but it is the de facto, I believe, is the word we like to go for. Let's make it official. What would make it official? It is the most used block explorer, absolutely. It was the first one to have all the detail information up there working, allowing trading in and out, balancing your portfolio. And yeah, I like to think that we are the most feature rich. We try and give all of the users what they want. Can't please all of the people all the time, but we get there. So yes, that's what we do.
And I always see the request in the RAL channel, hey Mog, add this, add that. What is the future timeline for Taostats, the block explorer? What is the iteration
But I
process
can't give
there?
away all of our roadmap in a slightly competitive industry, but it is to secure that position as the most feature-rich one-stop shop for all things Bittensor, and really satisfying all of what we call the personas. Validators, miners, subnet owners, retail investors, researchers, to make sure that we have the tools in place for all of those personas to interact with the network and get back all of the information they require. And as a result, from indexing and amassing this trove of data and then making it available from our API, being the one-stop shop for those wishing to build either something better, something alternative, supporting data infrastructure for subnets, or anything that anyone wants to build on the network where they realize the task ahead when indexing this chain is not quite as easy as you might think. And so just tapping into our API where we have indexed and continue to index masses of data points for the network.
What is the hardest part of indexing the Bittensor chain?
The size, I probably is being one of them. The fact that a normal blockchain, when you index, you have transactions and accounts and interactions. But what we have within Bittensor is an entire incentive landscape, and for an ever increasing number of subnets. So you imagine on every subnet you have 256 participants, and every single one of those participants has a state for every single block. And if you want to provide accurate historical data, you need to be able to look into how miners were performing, how much keys had earned, the routes, the weights that validators were setting, the weights that miners were receiving. And you need to really be able to go into those on a granular level across all participants in all subnets.
Yeah.
And that's not to mention, I will take a pause there for effect, and then you add detail to it, and you also then need to index these pools and the emissions going into these pools, out of these pools, the distribution of shares of dividends being emitted by these pools, the balance between the tau and the alpha, and where that's all going, and all of the delegation and undelegation events, which traditionally would be a staking event in a chain, but in other ways they very much are similar to a transaction within a DEX across all the subnets.
Yeah. So the staking is now very similar to DEXs in other protocols.
Yeah, it's a staking transaction. You have to delegate your tau into a subnet or the root. However, the way that you look at doing that makes it very, very similar to buying a coin or a token within an ecosystem.
And last time we spoke, you said you saw your vision for the future of Bittensor being a self-perpetuating network of growth. How has these pools that determine subnet emissions helped get us closer to that end goal of being a self-perpetuating network of growth?
Well, we had reached a number of limitations for growth, for fair market driven growth, which was the ability for the emissions or the value to be defined by the participants, the validators. And there was a bit of a roadblock there because it's only possible to really look at value of so many subnets in a fair way without bias through looking at the code, through involvement, through the product. That responsibility really had to be turned over to the greater participants of the network, any Tau holder, anyone who holds Tau. And the mechanisms to put that in place through dTAO are incredibly complex. And so a lot of focus has shifted on getting detail out into the wild, getting it shipped. Of course, for validators, subnet owners, miners, a lot of focus has been as to how they will adapt and participate within a detail world. And now that's out, and it has been a huge success. We can now get back to building and growing. The gates are open for subnet registration. You can now register a new subnet every day ad infinitum. That those limits can be changed. The lock cost now is recycled rather than locked, so that's an actual investment. You have to put your money on the table in order to register a subnet. But it means that we can now start to see and support an ever-growing list of subnets. Obviously, we forget that EVM was implemented just before detail, so we now have that aspect to look at. So it opens a lot of the floodgates for much more complex systems within Bittensor, but also the ability to develop within the core distributed compute ideologies of network.
Were there any concerns you had pre-detail about the launch and how it would go that have now been alleviated since we've seen a week?
I'm not going to say concerns. I think everyone is aware that a low liquidity market can be swayed. And that was always going to happen. But it's the same in any low liquidity market. We can speak of shifts of balance and power from validators to large holders or subnet owners or investors, those that are willing to put their TAO on the table again. But anyone that would who would criticize, and I'm certainly not in a position to criticize that, having been the subject of the criticism from being a member of the smaller group of validators who was defining value. It's natural in markets to have those with more market influence exert a greater influence over the markets. So I don't think we can see that as a criticism. And I think as a huge positive from that, we've got through, or we're getting through, the low liquidity phase much quicker than I think any of us anticipated. And that's really, really positive. It was helped along by a slight chain bug in the first few days where slightly more alpha than was originally designed was output, but that's actually been a huge benefit. I believe what we'll see is, instead of seeing a roller coaster bunch of parabolas that would have taken a little while to even out, we actually had a fairly large one, and we're going to start to see an evening out much quicker than we thought, which is reflected by the fact that the OTF were about to tighten up the constraints on the EMA, the moving average, which ties essentially emissions of a subnet to price. There was a delay in that, meaning that you had to sustain a certain price for a longer time for your emissions to catch up. That this is a safeguard to prevent manipulation of the price through large buys and sells. But as the liquidity is built up, we now feel in a position where we can tighten the relationship between the two, which better aligns the sentiment of the market to the emissions of a subnet.
You touched on a very subtle point there that not a lot of people know or realize. That there was a bug in the alpha distribution, and you could attribute that to how we reached a total sum of 4, almost 4, like 9 point something or 3.9 something. Can you explain, or at least talk about what had happened there? And that has now been solved, by the way.
I can abstract the bug. It passed me by because I was too busy looking at my alpha balance, and I was alerted to it at the point that it was the fix was pushed out for it. So there was a slight bug in the emissions rate, so the amount of alpha that was being emitted into the pools. And I'm not 100% certain if it was to not specific participants by their keys, but based on certain parameters. And I think there was. You can read into the bug if you look on the code. There was a push the other day which fixed the bug. But the long and short of it is more alpha, or alpha was emitted at a much higher rate into the pools. This does mean that those that were aping into alpha at those times saw higher returns. But there is obviously the flip side of that is that more alpha was emitted, and then there was a larger, as I say, a larger parabola than was anticipated was created. But that's not, as I say, such a bad thing to get that out of the way in the early days when people were screaming from the rooftops. If you don't know exactly what you're doing, stay out. Because you are paying well over market value, and there are some traders who knew what they were doing, and of course they profited, as will happen in many of these low liquidity launches. But I feel like there wasn't any abuse of the system per se. It's just amplified the initial effects, and now we can move past those, and it's helped us get to stability, or a closer sense of stability. We're now at 1.59 Tau, the total sum of subnet value, subnet price against Tau. Now, whether that means that Tau is undervalued or subnets are overvalued is another point of discussion we can come to. We're just implementing a moving chart for that on Taostats today and tomorrow, so we'll have that up there very soon so you can follow that historically. But it's going to be a very interesting chart to look at.
Yeah, that is a good question. Do you think subnets are overvalued, or you think Tau is undervalued? What's Mog's opinion?
Well, if you asked me last week, I would have said both without question. Subnets were being overvalued and Tau undervalued. We knew subnets would be initially overvalued because there was great incentive to acquire alpha for long term. So a lot of people were putting funding in based on not what they thought a subnet was worth now, but what they thought the subnet would be worth later, and that ability to acquire greater sums of alpha, and then also those who will gain from increased emissions of a subnet can inject, essentially, not burn, but throw Tau into the fire in order to create price momentum on their subnets, in order to drive up, especially with the longer, slower reacting EMA. Once you manage to early on sustain a high emission rate, it's been harder to knock that down. Again, this is something that will balance over time, and I feel like these are just initial startup effects that we were all very well aware of what would happen, and everyone has played their own different game. Some were concentrating on their own subnets, others were concentrating on trading other people's. There've been all sorts of tactics, I think, but as was echoed by a gentleman that was on Mark Jeffries' hash rate, many people from the outside feel it was just a closed group of Discord only geeks, people playing around in the command line interface who were doing this. I think what's most important is that the mechanisms haven't been broken, the mechanisms haven't been abused. It stood up to the test of time. Taostats was able to record and show you all of this going on in real time, and it's now a new week. It's now 9 days old. We're 9 days into detail, and it hasn't broken, and it's not looking like it's going to.
And I believe you had mentioned Taostats saw like a 4x increase in traffic.
Yes, Taostats trap not only the traffic for the site itself, but our API traffic, our RPC call traffic, having the first trading interface where people could actually buy and sell the detailed tokens within the subnet pages on Taostats or via our dashboard delegation app, really stress tested our infrastructure. And we've always sort of said that we're building for enterprise, but it's always nice to have those tests at high volume moments, and we would absolutely, the website survived, so that was also a huge positive.
Yeah, I don't believe y'all crashed, so that's a good thing.
We did not crash, absolutely not. It took us an hour or so to get everything initially working. It took a little longer for the data for the charts to flow through. We would have liked the charts to have been available on the moment of launch. We had the chart data from the first block, but it was one of those you think you've tested in testnet, but once we flick the switch, there's a little bit of scrambling around to make sure things work on mainnet, because everything is so vastly different in an incentive-driven mainnet than it is in a theoretical testnet.
Yeah, and talking about the launch, I don't know if you saw, but someone had bought one Subnet 8 alpha token for, I believe, 48 Tau. Was this something you anticipated to happen?
Someone sent me something about Subnet 33. Someone had bought AS3 or 8 of their token for 53 Tau. I think they were people who didn't understand the dynamics of early aping, because of course those that were doing this properly were running scripts that were buying just a carefully calculated amount block after block after block after block. So of course, buying a large amount early on was not sensible. But people have bought pizza for 1,000 Bitcoin, so there's always going to be points in history where we can look at a coin that's been wasted for the greater good.
Yeah. And I think the dTAO launch was a good reminder that we are still in crypto. We're still involved with the cryptocurrency here. Last time you were on my podcast, you said the association to crypto was the biggest pain point or the biggest point of contention for people when getting involved with Bittensor. How do you think this will change over time, and does dTAO help or hurt this perception or narrative with
Yep.
crypto?
It's an evolution because I was on stage a year ago and so 6 months ago saying I'm not in crypto anymore, I'm in Bittensor. I certainly can't say that anymore. What I felt was that we had issues attracting the right kind of developer talent from the AI industry and potentially other industries into building on distributed incentivized networks, because in order to have a decentralized, distributed, incentivized network, you need to use a decentralized ledger to record that incentive, and ergo you have a blockchain. And a lot of people are very wary of crypto, of anything that's launching on crypto, regardless of what you say. If it's got a cryptocurrency and a token attached to it, they're very wary. So it keeps some of these bright minds from the door. And then you have the brighter minds potentially within the blockchain space who might have been off building on bigger networks on other things. The meme coin narrative at the moment certainly isn't helping that. But through the deployment of EVM, suddenly we've got the attention of a lot of strong DeFi builders on other networks. We also now, through the exposure of this, what is understood now to be a very fair market-driven valuation, a valued economy, people are starting to pay a little bit more attention. And so it is starting to drive attention towards Bittensor from strong teams, and you can only hope that reputation continues to grow, that eventually those who may have been slightly hesitant or wary to deploy within a blockchain space understand that there is a future for distributed ledger in the advancement of business, and not just the buying and selling of coins named after dogs with big ears or whatever else they put out there.
Yeah. Also, last time we talked, I believe there was only one subnet at the time using organics, really, and that was Subnet 19 back in August. Now there's subnets, multiple subnets with organics incorporated, and are doing multiple billion tokens on Open Router in the regular AI economy, so to speak.
Yep, and
How
they were
have you
talking about the
seen?
inference subnets. So the inference subnets, the biggest two being 19 and 4. So 19 is called 19 and 4 is Targon. And both of them really stepped up to getting on OpenRouter. I believe 19 was first, quickly followed by Targon. Both of them serving DeepSeek and jumping on the DeepSeek, and they actually outperformed or outserved Azure and the centralized providers in the terms of the number of tokens. And I think both of those subnets are firmly orientated towards organic queries. And 19, I believe, only last week I tweeted about it, had a big update that has massively reduced the redundant miner costs and validator costs by reducing the number of synthetic queries that flow through the network, because they serve no benefit and there's such a huge number of organics. So that's fantastic. That's something I only dreamt about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago when I got into this. But then there are, with dTAO and this need to prove value and revenue beyond concept, all subnets have very much orientated, or the greater majority, towards product. So this, if you're trying to serve a product to real customers, synthetics, a lot of the new subnets are not even being designed around synthetics. They're being designed to offer functional client-facing products.
And then the inference subnets are still on top. Do you think that will always be the case for Bittensor, that inference subnets are
No.
what's best suited?
The inference subjects, and although Targon is on top at the moment, some of that may be driven by team stimulation, and it's the early days. Let's see how this one pans out. But really, I think the people's favorite at the moment seems to be Shoots, and Shoots is serverless compute. So it's and then also in the top five you have a compute subnet, although I'm not quite sure how sustainable the compute subnet business models are. But if you look at things like Shoots, which is serverless compute, so you can deploy any model, spin it up without having to spin up servers and configure servers, and then instantly access it via API. So they were also running the large version of DeepSeek and countless other things. Gradients, where you can come on and train LLMs, or now also image models, so you can arrive with yours or an existing data set, your base model or an existing base model from Hugging Face, and just go on and train them as you wish. Subnets like 13, where you can arrive with a set of keywords and go and send it out to scrape enormous data sets on your behalf. Inference was the darling poster boy child of AI last year, because it's so easy to explain to people. It's like ChatGPT. And the network itself is also pushing many aspects which may incorporate elements of AI, but are not purely AI based. A lot of the price orientated, price optimization subnets, those that are using the miners to produce data that has value outside of potentially training, pre-training, fine-tuning and inference, are all stepping up. I think that we've carried over a lot of the reputations from pre-dTAO. We complained a lot about the emissions ratings within the pre-dTAO, but post-dTAO, they look very similar. But I believe that landscape will change as a greater amount of people begin to assign value based on what they actually see and what these teams deliver.
How long do you think it will take before you kind of see the order kind of settle down and not move around so much from these low liquidity environments?
This is my personal view. So many people believe that it'll take anywhere between 60 and 120 days for things to settle. I think it was 90 to 120, and it's been brought back a bit to 60, or advanced a bit to 60 days. I think what we'll start to see is a clearer divide between the top subnets and the lower subnets, because there is now no deregistration. So a subnet can fade into oblivion, but it's still there. I do believe that might spring a secondary market, a subnet market, where people try and sell subnets that they no longer need, because essentially an exit liquidity with a chunk of the alpha. It's a natural market effect of the way things are designed. But I think we'll see a split, and as we start to see that gap between the valued subnets and the non-valued subnets, I think then we'll start to see a hierarchy start to form. And what I'm looking for and I'm waiting for are new subnets that launch with a strong product, a working front end, a working incentive mechanism, and the time it takes them to establish themselves in the public eye, in the investors' eyes, and also as a functional product. And when we see that, happen effectively, I think then we would have hit the state at which anything is possible based on the value you bring to the ecosystem, rather than the reputation you may have forged over the past year with people within the network.
And the no deregistration now, you said that you think people will start to sell their keys that own the subnet. Do you think this will be a feature that will be changed in the future to where it will bring back deregistration to kind of prune some of these subnets that are dead?
I don't think you can deregister. You used to be able to deregister your subnet manually in the code if you really wanted to just step away. I'm not sure you can do that anymore. I would have to double check that. But I do know that obviously there's no limit on subnets, and the idea is that subnet cost is attainable and accessible. I think the minimum subnet cost is 10 tau. which would, in current prices would be $4,200. That's a very attainable cost. It's currently sitting at about 500 because there was a lot of demand for these initial subnets, and especially, I believe, possibly some demand for subnet 69. Now 69 has been registered. I feel like we'll probably find an equilibrium somewhere between 1 and 200 Tau. Would be my estimation of what people are prepared to spend to register a subnet, which is between $40,000 and $80,000 to essentially get your business off the ground. But as demand maybe for new subnets drops, then that will drop. And I personally, especially as someone who is involved in the potential launch of some new subnets, would rather have an untainted UID, a new UID. But if you look into the economics, there may be advantages to picking up on the second-hand market a net UID that the owner already has a chunk of alpha, because obviously they will have accumulated alpha. Even if that alpha is worth nothing, if you buy that UID on the second-hand market, then if you then assign value to it through good product, you instantly have a nice large amount of controlling alpha of that subnet. So I'm sure this will play out. I know that there were some subnets that changed hands in the very early moments of dTAO, as some had been secured just before the switch over for very large amounts of Tau, and they were then swapped over to new owners. As I say, I like to look at the value subnets are producing and not worry too much about shenanigans that people are doing to make a little bit of extra Tau on the side.
And just to speculate, why do you think Subnet 69 had such high demand for registration?
The same reason Subnet 420 will.
What are your opinions on these meme-ish subnets that have like tokenomics to where it's like the more, or incentive mechanisms to where the more you hold of the alpha token, the more incentive you get? Do you think we'll see more of those? What is your opinion on the current ones?
Well, I feel that we will see more. I've been saying it quite a lot in my interviews over the past couple of weeks, that in 2025, novel revenue models are the new meta in Bittensor. Stimulating the holding and valuation of your alpha are going to be critical to business success as a subnet. However, I would like to see, and I've seen this has been discussed openly amongst many subnets that I either advise or have an ear to the ground in, is what should we consider rewarding miners proportionally for the amount of alpha they hold. Now, if you're performing an action and your subnet is generating value, there are going to be lots of mechanisms you can look into to say, well, that might work, that might not work. Here are some advantages, some disadvantages. Let's see how we can build out and test and play with this. Maybe we'll get it wrong, but maybe let's try it and see. But when a subnet rocks up and says, hey, we are only rewarding for that, and our subnet does nothing else of any value, I guess I feel the same way as I do about meme coins, which is, this token does nothing. We are literally rewarding you, or we get assigning value to it because the people here before you thought it was valuable, and they want you to think it's valuable so that the people after you think it's valuable. I believe we call that a Ponzi scheme. And I guess the sour taste there that I think needs to not be overlooked is that all subnets launched with an even set of emissions. At launch, they were all 1.54, which was 100 divided by 64. And so a lot of these subnets, or this particular meme subnet you're talking about, had a chance to accumulate a lot of the alpha. And anyone that was in the know of this subnet also did. So to then announce a week later that, hey, we're going to do a subnet where the people with the most alpha stand to profit, it's kind of like routing your own mining emissions to yourself. And so the cards or the pieces are in place for those that have organized this to nicely reap value from it. And I'm interested to know, especially when the EMA is updated, how the greater community will react. Because I've seen someone sum up Bittensor as its pump fund for intellectuals. And I hope that the Bittensor community is wise enough that they will look at this and say, this is not how we want our network to be used, and so we're not playing this game. They can go off and buy meme coins anywhere else, but they look at potentially a subnet on Bittensor, an expectation of a more admirable usage than just meme profits and exit liquidity for those that were in there early.
You hinted at this. Do you think these subnets that produce real value will adopt those same type of economic systems? So it kind of makes the meme coin subnet irrelevant because the ones actually producing value have that same type of incentive built in as well?
They will have to, but the reality is that the amount of revenue that a subnet, even if you're doing 100% buyback with all revenue, and I know Shoots have already implemented a buyback where all of the subscription revenue goes straight back into their alpha. But if you look at the valuations, especially the speculative early valuations of these subnets, and you say, is this subnet, if this subnet is turning over a volume of, for example, $1 million worth a day, are they generating anywhere close to that in revenue? Does it matter if they buy back even an optimistic revenue, 20k a day of their token, compared to the speculative value that's going around? In the long term, yes, there will be requirements to build, I think, more detailed loyalty-based relationships with your miners. And I actually think this is something that is just to do with the business models being developed, that a lot of subnets will be a piece in the toolbox of businesses, but some of their business and the way they interact with their customers may actually go on outside of Bittensor. So whether it's premium services, let's say you use your subnet as a proving ground for anyone in the world to show their worth. And to continue to show their worth and potentially to service the public. But you have a closed basket of private customers to whom you pick the best off the subnet and then offer a private service on the side. It would then be up to you, if you want to use revenue and profits from that, to stimulate the further growth of your subnet. And I think as we eventually enter a bear market and emissions really start to decline, then we will start from a dollar value, we'll start to understand those who have sustainable business models, sustainable businesses as a whole, and understand the ways in which they can use revenue and growth to stimulate growth even in a declining market.
Yeah, that would be interesting. You're suggesting like a centralized company comes in, builds a subnet, so miners develop something that they now take back to a centralized company and sell as a centralized product? You could see that happen?
Well, I'll tell you where it's come up in conversations with subnets that I've advised. It's about privacy. You may sell a service where 80% of the users or 90% of the users are very happy for it to flow over an open network to the miners who perform a service that's then returned. And that's great. It's super cost effective and it's optimum to be developed over or to be deployed on Bittensor. But you may have a small subset of clients who wish that their, let's call it a job, their payload is private, and currently a miner must receive that payload. A miner is generally anon; they're just hiding behind a UID. If you wanted to service those clients with that expertise, you've used Bittensor and the incentive mechanisms of Bittensor to identify a core group of people who perform a task to the best, the highest standards by which you require. At some point, you may want to reach out to them and say, "Hey, would you be prepared to sign a service level agreement, an NDA, and work privately with some of our customers?" Some may say, "No, I'm not responding to you," but if it is a feasible business option to be offering a pro product or an enterprise product where you're using the talent that you've sourced through Bittensor to perform. I mean, there are other examples where the outputs from Bittensor are being combined with either proprietary data or other sources of data to provide a greater product. Industry expertise. There are some companies that are deploying within Bittensor who have years and years of expertise and also a lot of proprietary data in their industry, and they seek to enhance that data with the miner outputs, but the miner outputs are not everything.
You've worn many different hats in Bittensor, right? You've been a miner, subnet owner, validator. You run Taostats. Now you're talking about designing these subnets, and you said you had a couple subnets coming. Um, what are all the subnets in your portfolio currently that you have a piece in?
Oh, we call it me. Obviously, I'm part of a greater organization. Uh, we developed 18 originally, having been asked to develop API access for the network, and been a little bit of an arms race at the time with neural internet. That was the driving force behind Corcell. And what we realized when building Corcell, which at the time was called BitAPI, but it's now Corcell, was that the outputs from the current Inference subnet, the only one at the time, which was looking to reward diversity in this mixture of experts model, was not optimum. And we also saw that a lot of the network was not orientated towards organic queries, something I've spoken about a lot. And a lot of people subnets had just been released, and everyone was building subnets based on the same template building blocks. And even though I'm not an AIML engineer no, I'm not a talented subnet builder, I understood that we needed to do something a little bit different to stimulate growth. And so we took away the worry of actually providing the inference and just use existing centralized API endpoints. Yes, from a marketing point of view, you can also say that we're providing unrestricted access to GPT, and it was at the time being used for data sets, but that was quickly stopped because it was not very popular with GPT, with OpenAI. So what we then did was I then worked with Namare, who's now gone on to found Graichen Labs, who wrote 19, which we supported initially, and have a stake in. So there's obviously 18 and 19. And that was the building blocks on which we could really push Corcell. We wanted Corcell as a product then to encompass the outputs from many, many subnets and provide API access to many, many subnets. And we really pushed in that. And we were possibly too early in that because the subnets were not there in producing enterprise grade usable or consumer grade usable outputs. And so as we tried to incorporate them into the playground, we would find fault. And as things evolved and the landscape evolved over the 6 months, it started to shift towards subnets being responsible for building their own infrastructure and their own products. And it started to be less economically viable for them to be supporting validators and any external entity who was building these products. So Corcell in that way, I wouldn't say it's remained stagnant. It's remained very attached to 18 and 19. It hasn't had a need to use any other inference subnet because none of the other inference subnets are offering anything that 19 is not. And so Corcell does what it does. And then me personally switched my focus back to Taostats, which was very much needed. Building up a team takes time, and we had a period where we really had to rebuild the team to understand where we were going to take Taostats into the future, and it took some time. And Namare went off and formed Graichen Labs, which has now produced what I would consider to be two of the strongest subnets on Bittensor, which is gradients and shoots. So from when you say me, I have no part in those particularly. I was not a developer in 18 or 19. I like to say in 18 was my idea. There was Fish that built it, and then we've kind of passed responsibility back and forward in terms of updating and developing it. We've now taken it back on board in terms of maintaining it. But in the later days towards dTAO, I miss talking about subnets because Namare has been very, very busy off doing his things. And I had a couple of chance encounters. I would say that a lot of people that came to me wanted me to back subnets, constantly backing subnets. And contrary to popular belief, we weren't backing subnets. We weren't paying registration fees for anybody that came to us asking for it because in the early days when we considered it, it turns out the code and the subnets were terrible, and we didn't want to put our name behind it. So we said, I think we did one. I'm not going to single them out, and we let it get deregistered within a week or so because it was awful. They wouldn't show us the code base before. I mean, it's an easy gamble to take as an investor because you get your funds back. But I think they assumed that because we backed them, they would get emissions, and we didn't. So I stayed away from it. But in my quest to show how I feel things should be being deployed on Bittensor, we've actually backed two very different subnets. Also three, actually, I forgot about that. There is another one. And two of them will be launching soon. One of them is Condensers, which is 47, which is actually currently live. And for me, that was about building relationships with developers. You working with the developer from 47 I felt was very important to both him and myself. I now have him working with him on the new subnet, which will come out soon. And for me, what I want to show is the launch of subnets as a business, as a product, with everything ready, working, to go, that people can look at, and not only look at from a technical point of view, like, oh, this is an interesting use of Bittensor. They can look at it from a custom point of view and say, oh, this is a product that I would like to use. And the two may not be related. The customer may have nothing to do with the Bittensor network. And then from an investor's point of view, you can say, I can see this, I can see a growth in valuation here, and I'm prepared to invest by acquiring the alpha token for this subnet. So that's what I want to do, because we've yet to see a post-dTAO full subnet product launch to my satisfaction. That was a long answer, wasn't it?
And launching with a product, Corcel was, I believe, one of the two first products on Bittensor, like consumer interface. And that started with Subnet 18, which was, like you said, almost an API wrapper of sorts.
Well, where credit's due, we'll give it to them. The foundation had the first chat tensor, but it was, I believe, it was never really pushed in the public eye, and it had teething problems. And then it was a guy called Creative Builds who had one of the very first non-OTF subnets, Subnet 5, an image subnet. And he actually, for the entirety that subnet was in testnet, before subnets were even live, had Tao Studio, which was the first image generating subnet. And we incorporated that into Corcel. I believe there was also a kind of Telegram bot or a Discord bot that you could type Imagine and that Neural Internet made and would generate an image based on that. But unfortunately, that subnet became exploited very quickly, and the mechanism didn't stand the test of time. And he deregistered it fairly. I think he walked away from it. And that's where 18 and 19 took up the mantle, and then Corcel. So I won't claim that Corcel was the first. I think it was the first to stand up to the test of time. Obviously, it's still there. It still has a lot of users, Corcel. We all use it in my family. My daughter told me the other day, she said, Papa, I saw someone using Corcel at school. I said, did you tell them about it? They said, no, I didn't at all. They were just using it organically. So it's in the public eye. We've never overly marketed and pushed it because I don't know. I never wanted to be, I'm not sure if I can say that on a public podcast, but I will anyway. I never wanted to be an app wanker. An app wanker is someone who turns up at a party and it just tells you about their app and just gets you to download their app. And I felt like there was more value to add to the Bittensor ecosystem. So there we go.
I could understand that. Taostats, though, is becoming sort of an app, and your validator. How has your role specifically changed pre-dTAO to post-dTAO, besides just setting admissions? What other factors do you now have to consider, or things do you have to do, or maybe nothing at all has changed?
Well, there was definitely a shift in validator responsibility and role even pre-dTAO. As child hotkey, hotkeying, which is the ability for a validator not to run infrastructure, but to delegate their stake to a participant who is running infrastructure. It has changed a lot of the dynamic of validators. It's allowed small enterprises or new enterprises to spring up and instantly have a very competitive yield. So it's taken away, or I'd like to say it took away the competition for yield, but it didn't. And obviously, this being Bittensor, there is still political arguments between weight copying, child keying to weight copying, etc., etc. You'll notice that Taostats has tried to kind of step a little bit back from that. From the early days where we were running all infrastructure on all subnets, and I prided myself in that, enabled me to connect with the teams. And then as it got more and more difficult, and you have fallback scripts. If a validator falls down, you essentially start wait copying in order to maintain the APR. And I think there was a point where I'd been away for about 3 weeks, and it came out in public that of my 64 validators, I think 12 of them were wait copying, and I had to question myself that was I the person best suited to be doing this, and where was the value in it? We were taught that validators will build on subnets, and therefore your bandwidth is your access point and your key to that. Now there are many camps as to the how we value this or not, and I realized that obviously any subnet that I wish to build on, I must run a validator on. Those that I'm actually building on and actually using, of course we're running validators on, but I didn't shy away from the reality of that's a handful. And the rest of them currently, there was no interest or there was no benefit from me. And I don't think it was even about the funds at this point, more the time, my time that was being used to maintain these validators. And as Taostats infrastructure costs grew and then far outweighed the costs of subnet infrastructure, it was an extra 25 to 30k a month that we didn't need to be spending, and we could be spending on bolstering up the databases, the backups and load balancers, the databases, and everything that Taostats does. So my role there, and that was a huge weight off my shoulders. I could then engage with subnets purely based on what they were doing, rather than how difficult it was for me to deploy on them. And I can't pretend that there isn't bias instilled by a subnet can have a great concept, but if the team is terrible at helping you to set up the validator, and the validator setup is very complex, there is an initial bias that says, oh, this one's a hassle, even if in the end of the day they may have a very, very strong idea, concept, and an eventual product. So I like having that bias removed. I now get to concentrate on judging the subnets as everyone else would. And as an individual, I now get to have a much stronger opinion without having to worry so much about being fair and unbiased, because I can have my opinion. I'm entitled to my opinion, it turns out now. Whereas before I was always very, very careful. I tried to be. Now, as a validator, I feel a lot of our responsibility, as Taostats, is to facilitate the ability for everyone to engage in alpha. That's, I think, what I felt was my responsibility in the last few months. I took it very seriously. I think Jacob understood that I understood this, and we had a lot of conversations about when he was going to launch dTAO and how ready we needed to be, what needed to be in place. I know there were other providers out there who were also providing interfaces, but I think deep down he knew that we wouldn't let him down. We haven't let him down yet. We're not going to, and that we would provide the infrastructure would be in place. And that for me shows in the alpha to root proportions that you see on Taostats. When you look at a validator, when you look at the subnets, when you look at anything, you can see the amount of stake that is moving from 100% root into alpha. And in order to do that, dTAO had to be something that was open to everyone, available to everyone, not just something you could use in the command line interface if you knew what you were doing. So that was really my focus, and that continues to be my focus through education, but also through tooling now, because of course education has now been taken up by a number of validators who are looking to find their place, shall we say, within the ecosystem, and people realize that subnet knowledge and understanding and education is also key. So a lot of validators are now making their USP education. There's a guy called Maciek who runs Learn Bittensor, who I should give a shout out to, who's doing an incredible job. So whereas I did want to provide the educational portal for Bittensor, we can't do everything, and you have to do what you're good at, and he's very good at it. Turns out it's also powered on Taostats, so I'm going to give him a shout out as well. He's recently been acquired by Latent Holdings, which is the validator run by JJ from OSS Capital, and Voon, who's an OTF developer. So there's a lot of people doing a lot of things, and what I've now switched my focus back to is my original reason for being here and being put on this stage was to provide tooling and data and the ability to visualize the data on Taostats. So that's where our focus is going to be over the next 6 months, is really advancing that role.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It allows everybody to go back to what they're good at, essentially.
Yeah.
Because when you pre-detail, you were forced to do these things that necessarily wouldn't be something you'd choose to do. And you have a good point you raised there with the validator bandwidth and access. If you don't have value for what the subnet produces, what would be the reason to actually run the validator code and not just wait copy if you have no use for what is being produced there? So I guess in the interest of efficiency and providing value to people that want to access alpha, it is better to wait copy in those scenarios.
I'm going to interrupt and disagree there. No, that's a choice. The choice to wait copy or child key, or where you child key to, is very, very important. We have always seen it as our responsibility to place our stake through child keying to the participant of the network, of the subnet, who has the greatest chance of raising the value of that network, and even to our competitors. I remember messaging Caro from Targon and saying, "Look, mate, I know you're our competitor, but I don't want to. We're not using you right now. Which validator is it? Yourselves or another validator? Is this stake best served?" And he advised me, and we child delegated through there. So the choice to child key to a wait copy or not is still a conscious choice. Now people should be moving towards the subnet owners, assuming the subnet owners have proved some responsibility and also the ability to run a validator. It turns out people laugh or are quick to point out your faults when you're running 64 validators and a few of them go into backup wait copying mode. But there's a lot of subnet owners who run just the validator for their own subnet, who fall down. I'm always watching, because I'm always watching. And I often message them and say, hey, your validator hasn't set waits in 4 days. And then, oh, sorry, it was the weekend. I'm like, the role of a validator does not have weekends. Like, I'm sorry. And I said this to someone this morning. They said, oh, I was on holiday. I said, validators don't go on holiday. If people are building infrastructure. So they have a lot to learn, but we still have a responsibility to direct our stake in the most positive and constructive manner, and also to help and educate those who we direct the stake towards in order to make the most of it.
Okay, so you're saying instead of wait copying now, we just child key to whoever is best suited for that subnet?
Correct. Now, often there are some validators who have very much pushed towards running infrastructure. So I'll give the shout outs here. The OTF team, I can't remember the name of their validator team that run the team at OTF who run the validators, it's actually even surprised me, have really stepped up and for me are one of the best validation teams alongside Roundtable 21 and Rizzo. And they've made it their USP to really run on all subnets. I believe that they should probably make it. Well, let's see where they go. OTF has an 18% take on their validator, but they don't have a take on their child keys. Rizzo, he was 0%. I think he's now gone up to 9%, and he's put a percentage on his keys. Roundtable, their validator take is there, but I don't remember what it is, but they don't have a take on their child keys. This is going to be an interesting dynamic. On the validators on the subnets that we validate on as Taostats, we have a take on our key. Well, I think it makes natural sense. You're saying to someone, hey, you know what? I'll run the infrastructure. I'll pay for the infrastructure. I'll run it optimally. I'll man it. And yeah, you can piggyback off it. But there's a small fee. That's how business works. So it's very nice how things are going at the moment, but we'll start to see how that goes. The only participant who's incentivized not to put a take on there is a subnet owner. Because mostly subnet owners, they need that support from validators or from those with stake to give them that bandwidth into their subnet in order to build the products. Now there is some controversy at the moment between about the role of validators. Do validators need to exist in the role that they've been, or can they exist in more of an auditor role? I know Shoots was pushing more towards less validators and have had some friction from validators who have insisted that they want to continue the role of validators, and there's a lot of discussion going on there. As long as a network is growing and moving forward and evolving, it's all positive. We have to have these discussions, and there have to be participants trying things new. We can't just all be copying each other. We have to be pushing forward and pushing forward. But those roles are being played with and identified and looked at by all the various participants.
And how hard is it exactly to run on all the subnets, all 64, which is now increasing? At what point does it become unviable or impossible to do?
It's not impossible. I did it as one person without a great amount of sysadmin, with zero knowledge in doing this before I got into Bittensor. I was fortunate enough to have the years to grow. So when you have teams that are professional in running infrastructure and have process in place, automations, scripts, notifications, fallbacks, and a team at least spanning two time zones, overlapping time zones, it's not the most it's not easy. The frustration, I think, comes with staying on top of subpar code bases. So you may be very, very experienced in running this infrastructure, but you may have new subnets who it's their first time foray into Bittensor, and they think they know what they're doing, and then they launch on mainnet and they realize, and with all due respect to them, that it wasn't as it was on testnet, and suddenly they're fighting a lot of battles. They haven't understood that there's a lot of different people deploying on different infrastructure, different dependencies, different issues. They realize they have to support all these validators, and that's the point where it can get tough. It's those interactions with the teams and the constant communications and waiting for things to be fixed, and then dealing with potential exploits on subnets. So you have to stay on the ball. But that's not to say that it can't be done. And this is why I believe the child key take is going to be an eventuality, because as a number of subnets expand, so will the manpower required and the costs required to run on them. And I guess optimizing that will be a task for validators. I do believe that validators in the long term, in a world with 1,000 subnets, will only operate on subnets that it is profitable or incentivized for them to do so, whether because they're deploying product on those subnets or because there is enough demand for their presence there that it is profitable for them to be there.
And then how do you view the problem of weight copying moving forward? Do you view it as now eventually the subnet owner is going to be the one that has to create the incentive mechanism in a way to where weight copying is not viable, or do you think it will just be something that always exists?
You will note that Taostats has now removed the weight copying mark. It was never something I was particularly comfortable with. I kept asking the public with each major update we did whether we should get rid of it or not. And other than the weight copiers, everyone wanted to keep it. We've now removed it because I think a lot of the APR within Taostats is very much based on your choices, your individual choices in terms of what subnets you allocate to and how you allocate to them and when you go in and when you come out. So we're going to focus much more on your personal performance within the network. And it was also became very easy to obfuscate your return. So someone could not be a weight copier on their main key and then create a bunch of keys themselves, child key to those, weight copy on those keys, add a hidden take on them. There's all these ways around it. And I just felt that for me, the eventual outcome are novel incentive mechanisms that no longer require the validator just to perform the same repetitive task for which the rewards are given. I look to a world where validators and miners, especially validators, are rewarded directly for their involvement in the network outside of just setting weights, so that the weight setting itself isn't going to be where profit is. And so in order to really generate profit and value from a subnet, they're going to have to do something, perform a task of work. And I know this will happen. And when this does, then it won't matter anymore. So I think it will essentially nullify it or make itself relevant and a thing of the past. But for now, it's just a byproduct of the chain.
So over time, you're saying it will eventually go to where it doesn't even matter because these validators will be incentivized to build products and actually make money in the real world, is what I'm hearing.
To build product or to fulfill tasks. I don't want to give too much away. I feel like we'll have the third round of our conversations in a few months' time, and I'll allude a little bit more with examples as to what I mean. But yes, I believe that we will be able to assign value to participants in the network based on more than just the weights that they set, which could be similar to building product. Watch this space.
Yeah, no. You got 2 subnets on the way. Don't give away your alpha. But I'm very intrigued by the fulfill tasks. Very intrigued by what that may mean in the future, and absolutely, once those are out, we'll come back. We'll do this again. So last time we spoke, we also talked about how subnets kind of need to raise the bar for what they're doing, and 19 at the time was the shining star, your example that you used. How have you seen the level rise of subnets since back in August to now post-dTAO?
Well, Namare always said that I think it was taking his words, where we each need to stand on the shoulders of the next best of the best subnets and build forward from there. 19 spawned Fiber, which was essentially a foundation from which you can build subnets in a far more efficient manner than the old template that people were using. And I think 5, 6, maybe even 7 or 8 subnets are now built using Fiber. The incentive mechanism from 19 was adopted on other inference subnets. Things have been copied. So people have stood on Namare's shoulders. And he has now, and in his own words, partnered with John Durbin, who was one of the most talented miners, and in his words, someone whose intellectual capacity for in terms of application to Bittensor far outweighs his ability to produce shoots. And at each step of the way, it's just improving and getting better. And so shoots is now the shining star, I believe, especially in terms of application and what it can achieve. Because it's doing something that's not really there isn't really a centralized competitor as such, and yet it's being done through Bittensor. I do think there's some also from the same team, a lot coming from gradients. You look at the training subnets, so you've got 9 and now you've got 3, so it's training and then Templar, both of which are pushing each other, and there's a couple of other ones. This is not my speciality, but from those that I speak to who are very enthused by this aspect, the training side is being pushed further and further forward, and subnets are starting to feed off each other a lot more. So yeah, there are some advancements, and as I said, this can be another conversation we have in a few months' time, where you say we spoke in February and Shoots was at the top of the pile. Now we have Subnet 69. I've got no idea what it is.
Oh, okay. I thought you were
no,
dropping some out
so
that you're 69. You're Subnet 69.
No.
Okay. For the record, Morg is not.
For the record, I did not pay 650 Tau for Subnet 69. No.
Yeah. Okay. And then just a couple more things before we wrap up here. Namare has gone on to work with John Durbin. John Durbin, I can't say enough good things about him. Very brilliant. What does your relationship with Rayon look like? And Namare, is it just confined to 19, and you guys will just continue co-developing 19, or?
It is definitely defined by 19. I would co-developing would be giving myself or my side of things credit for where it's not due, because let's be honest, I don't have any hand in the development of 19. That is firmly the Rayon team. But I look on my relationship with Rayon, or specifically Namare, with pride, with immense pride. I have to be careful because obviously Namare is not doxed. But I remember our first meetings, our first communications, him starting working with us, first of all, to develop Corcel, introducing him and getting him over the initial hurdles of Bittensor, and then it's I'm not going to be patronising and call it a father-son relationship because I'm not old enough for that. But that pride you feel where someone goes off and does something and far exceeds your my ability. You think I feel like it's also for my narcissistic self, I was right, because I saw a huge amount of talent in this person and felt that the network would also benefit. I miss him. I miss talking to him, but I'm not the person he needs to talk to every day. And I found that I laugh about it because there's actually been an evolution in who I talk to the most every day in my time in the network. In my very first sort of months in the network, I spoke to someone who's a very dear friend of mine, actually, who I'm also not going to dox, but he was kind of very responsible for really pushing me within Bittensor, and we spoke every day. And then as we started to develop things, I spoke a bit more to my initial team. Along came Namare, and I spoke to him every day. Now he's off doing his things. I have my Taostats team who I speak to every day. My wife knows this. She's like, your internet friends, they change, but there's always one or two that I'm really speaking to constantly. And it's not him anymore. He's off doing his things, and I'm just really, really thrilled because I know he's very grateful for I'm not saying the opportunity because he made the opportunity, but for what he's been able to achieve. And I've made a lifelong friend out of it as well, which is obviously also of great value, probably of more value. So that's how I feel about what Graichen are doing. I think it's awesome. It's fantastic. We want to see the network grow. I wouldn't want to be sitting on a podcast trying to explain what it is that they do at a deeper technical level. So I'm not going to even pretend to take any credit or other than pushing him off in that direction initially from a long way back.
Yeah, when we first talked, it was about stimulating growth. That's growth. Yep. And then your other person that you were working with, Fish, on 18, co-developing there. Are you still working with him in that regard?
Fish and I have an interesting relationship. I'm very fond of him as a human being, and when you spend as much time in the network as the two of us have, you realize there are a lot of people in the network who are not honest, or who don't always speak their mind. That can certainly not be said of Fish. He is always honest and he always speaks his mind, even if you don't always agree with him or like what he's saying. But I'm not the only person to have said this. So there are other people who say, "Oh, you know what? I thought he was a dick at the beginning, but the longer I spend in his network, I realize he's one of the few people that is actually, his integrity is very, very strong because he's very consistent in who he is and what he believes and how he conducts himself." So we speak a lot. We're technically competitors with Tao Market Cap and Tao Stats, although I think we both have different goals for where we see it heading. You won't have seen competitors in a tech industry spend as much time on calls laughing at each other's sort of functionality and the things. We have to share a lot of stuff just for lols. He's doing a lot of good for the network. He works very, very hard, but he also makes some controversial decisions that don't always allow him to be perceived in the best public eye, and often make me question. And sometimes, and I'm not going to, and he's actually, it's funny, just before this call, there's a conversation going on behind closed doors about a choice or opinion that he has that's slightly controversial. I don't think it's fair at this stage to start talking about these things in public, because I respect the guy. But once again, we're being forced to challenge what we think about the structure of subnets, the structure of Bittensor, the structure of the roles within Bittensor, by someone saying, well, I'm doing this, and if you want to, you can do it too. I'm not breaking any rules. The code allows me to do this. This is what I'm doing. Do you like it? Do you not like it? You go away and reflect on that. We need those catalysts. We need those characters. But we're not really building stuff together anymore. I think he tried quite hard to get a team to focus on 18 so he could focus on his subnets. It didn't work. I now brought in a very talented developer who was originally a developer from Subnet 23. We then incubated 47, or he came to me with the idea for 47, and we helped him, backed him. Young Vietnamese guy, and really, really talented, but needed that help and experience in business development, also Subnet registration funding. But what I saw in there was someone who really wanted and was hungry to work on other subnets, and has now completely rebuilt 18, so it's now fully functional and far better than it was previously. Cured a lot of the any bugs and issues with it. Has now built 47. So as you say, fostering relationships. Namari doesn't need me anymore, so I'm just finding people to replace him in my life. That's not true. He's irreplaceable, but at the same time, working with younger devs to really guide them over the pitfalls. But Fish doesn't need me to guide him with anything. We have conversations, as I say, but he's very much his own man.
Absolutely. And that's what Bittensor's all about. Bring selfish individuals to all work towards one collective goal.
Selfish, or are you calling me selfish? I'd rather take the moniker of selfish myself than attain it to Fish.
No, everybody. That's in my perspective, the ideal is you take the sum of its parts. Yeah, so we've been going over an hour here. Mog, I'm going to ask you one last question. It's been great chatting with you. What advice, since you've worn so many different hats in Bittensor, every single level you could think of, miner, validator, subnet owner, mentor, block explorer, what advice do you have for people in this post-dTAO world, this new world of Bittensor?
Ooh, it might not be popular. I'm not sure if it's popular advice at the moment, with everyone looking to capitalize on the growth of subnets. But and it might be selfish advice because it's what I want to see. I would very much like people to be concentrating on the longer term of what they can build and what they can achieve, rather than short-term incentive extraction. And that's not to say, that is often people's initial draw into this network, be it as a miner, be it as now a trader, or someone building bots and algorithms and ARBs within dTAO. But none of that works if we don't have the people with greater vision understanding how they can use incentive mechanisms and distributed compute to solve problems and build for the future. So it's those people that I really want to speak to and encourage to get into the network. And whilst it may seem that there's always someone around you who's extracting more liquidity through mining, through this, through that, without those people, the network doesn't exist. And over the long term, those are the people that take the most value from the network. Maybe usually also in TAO, but in growth, experience, satisfaction, and achieving and building something of value, versus those that are just trying to extract every last row that they can.
Mog, it's been a great conversation today. I'm sure we'll have round 3 shortly once you have your other 2 subnets up and going. Wish you all the best of luck there, and keep doing your thing with Taostats. Really appreciate that. And I want to publicly thank you for doing the very first Ventura Labs podcast.
Thank you.
Without
Yeah,
you,
I was the first,
say
wasn't
I
I?
would be here today.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Thank you.